Hello and welcome to a lesson on factorising and solving quadratics. So this is going to allow us to use our skill that we've covered in the last few lessons, factorising quadratics, and then take it one step further to actually solve quadratic equations. So on the screen is a quadratic, x squared subtract 2x subtract 35. What I'd like you to do, just as a quick reminder, have a go at factorising this quadratic, pause the video and see if you can find the two brackets that this should be. Okay, so using the X box then, we're going to have 1 times negative 35 in the top of our grid, and then in the bottom, negative 2. So we're looking for two numbers that will multiply to make negative 35 and add to make negative 2. So if I go through my factor pairs for 35, I'll have 1 and 35, 5 and 7. So 5 and 7, there's a difference of 2 there, so that looks like it's going to work. But if I'm going to multiply them to make negative 35, then one of them has to be negative, because a negative times by a positive will give me a negative. And because when I add them, I want the answer to be negative 2, it's going to have to be negative 7 and positive 5. So filling in my grid then, I know that I'm going to get in here x squared, and in here negative 35. And then the negative 7 and the 5 are giving me the coefficients of the x's in the other two squares in my grid. So right here and here, I've only got an x squared, so I know it needs to be x and x. And then I'm looking for the common factors of this pair and the common factors of this pair in this row. So that's going to be negative 7 here. I know it's got to be negative because this is a negative 7 and that's positive. So when I multiply these together, I've got to get negative 7. And the common factor here then, of course, is 5. This one must be the positive one because here I've got positive 5x. So these bits here are giving me my two brackets, x subtract 7 multiplied by x add 5. Okay, so taking that on a step further then, this is the quadratic that we have just solved, that we've just factorised rather. And when we saw it on the last screen, it was an expression because it wasn't equal to anything. Now we've got an equation. So we've got the same expression we had before, but now it's equal to 0. So this is an equation rather than an expression. So we know that we can factorise that quadratic so that it's x subtract 7 multiplied by x add 5 equals 0. So this here is saying exactly the same thing as above because these two things are identical, they're equivalent. So we have a product. We are multiplying two things together, and the answer to that product is 0. Now, the only way that you can make a product which gives you an answer of 0 is if one of the things you're multiplying is equal to 0. So, for example, 4 multiplied by 0 is 0. You can't get an answer of 0 without having one of your factors being 0. So the fact that we know this product here is equal to 0 means that one or possibly both of these factors must be 0. So either x subtract 7 is 0, in which case if I add 7 to both sides, x equals 7, or x add 5 equals 0, and if I subtract 5 from both sides, I will get x is equal to negative 5. Now you can actually try both of these. You could substitute 7 into this equation and you will get 0. And you could subtract negative 5 into this equation and you will get 0. So these are both solutions. And this is a bit different from linear equations because there is more than one solution possible most of the time. Sometimes there's only one. And sometimes there aren't any at all when we can't factorise. But usually with a quadratic, we're expecting two solutions. So the key to today's work is that you are just going to factorise just like you've been doing the last few lessons, and then you take it on this next stage and you say, well, this factor equals 0, what is x? This factor equals 0, what is x? And you should be showing working, just like you can see in the bottom part of the screen here, But what you'll notice is that the two solutions are the same as the number that's in your bracket, but with the opposite sign. Now, if I were to graph this quadratic, I would get something that looks like this. And you'll notice something about where this quadratic is crossing the x-axis. Over here, it's crossing at -5. You can see -4 and -6 here. And over here, it's crossing at 7. We can see the 6 here. This next one along is 7. So these solutions here are telling us where y is equal to 0. Because if you look at the equation on the screen here, we've got a y where we've got a 0. So we've made y 0 in order to solve this. And these are called, you'll remember from a previous lesson, these are called the roots. So these solutions here are also the roots of my quadratic equation. When I graph it, that is where it will cross the x-axis. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is pause the video and have a go at factorising and then solving this equation. Pause the video and have a go. Okay, so A multiplied by C, 1 multiplied by -72 is -72. And then B, which remember is the coefficient of the x term here, is -1. So we're looking for two numbers that multiply to make -72 and add to make -1. So go through your factor pairs for 72. We've got 1 and 72, 2 and 36, 3 and 24, 4 and 18, 6 and 12, and then we've got 8 and 9. So 8 and 9 seem interesting because they've got a difference of 1. If I'm going to multiply 8 and 9 to make -72, then one of those numbers has to be negative. And if they're going to add to make -1, then I want -9 and 8. So filling in my box then, I'm going to have an x squared and a -72. And then I know the coefficients of my x's are going to be -9 and 8. Now I know that here and here in my grid, I'm going to have x and x. And then I'm looking at the common factors of these two in the column and the common factors of these two in the row. Now that's going to be -9 for this one. I know it's got to be the negative here because this is negative, so x times -9. And then this one, the common factor is 8, and it's got to be positive because this is positive. So my two brackets, x subtract 9 multiplied by x add 8, and I'm solving when that is equal to 0. So either x minus 9 is 0, in which case x equals 9, or x add 8 equals 0, in which case x is equal to -8. Okay, now once people have been shown how to factorise into two brackets and solve a quadratic, they tend to get stuck there and expect that everything factorises that way. But I'm going to remind you of some quadratics that factorise differently. So Xbox will actually work for every quadratic. If we remember, for example, in this one, that C is 0. So when we do 1 times 0, we'll have 0. And then B will be 25. But there's no need to use the Xbox here because I've got a common factor here of x. So I can just take out x, and that will be, those will be my two factor pairs. And from there, either x equals 0 or x add 25 equals 0, in which case x is -25. So be on the lookout for quadratics that just factorise by taking out an x or some multiple of an x. So these are the three types of quadratic that you might be able to factorise and then also solve. So we have got this type over here where we have got an x squared term, an x term and a constant. This is the one where we're going to want to use the x box. We can then put it into its two factor pairs, its two brackets, and then solve. This type here, where there is no constant, This is where you're going to want to take out a single term factor, an x or a multiple of x. So for example, with this one, oh, that should say x plus 25 in the bracket there, not x plus 5. But with this one, we're going to want to just take out the x. And then finally, this last one that has no x term, it's got an x squared and it's got a constant. This is the difference of two squares. Now, again, you can use the x box for that, but there is no need, because you should know that this is always going to factorise with the square roots of both of the parts in the brackets. So x subtract 4 and x add 4. And then we can go on to solve this. We know that either x equals 4 or x equals negative 4. Okay, so here is your work for today. This here says factorise and solve. So whereas underneath you can see it says factorise, you're not going to just factorise. You're going to factorise and then you're going to have that additional end bit where you're going to solve your equation as well. So bronze here, we've got all positive terms, which is going to make deciding what your numbers are a little bit more straightforward. Silver, we get into some negatives. And then gold, we've got a mixture of difference of two squares, quadratics where you've just got to take out a single term, quadratics where you've got a coefficient bigger than 1 in front of your x squared. So these are going to be your more complicated ones. So what I'd like you to do is pause the video and have a go at working through these at the appropriate level for you in your books.